and thank you so help for having me. My name is Adam White. I am a senior at Georgetown University. I'm studying international politics. I did policy debate for 4 years in high school and for 3+ years in college. So this is sort of right up my alley. I think Taiwan, and especially military relations with Taiwan, is an incredibly interesting issue, and it's one that I'm really looking forward to talk about. So I'm hoping to keep this lecture to about an hour-ish and then leave some time at the end for questions if anybody has any. The majority of this lecture will be focused on the history of US China Taiwan relations because that sort of provides the context for which military relations and military support exists in the modern day. And then at the end, we'll cover some of the pro and con arguments that I think are likely to be most relevant and prominent for the next couple of months. So the resolution is that the United States should substantially reduce its military support of Taiwan. We're going to focus on, in the first part of this lecture, on why the United States has chosen to support militarily Taiwan, and also the perhaps negative ramifications and just the overall context for doing so. So, first, a quick overview of Taiwan. So, Taiwan is not a country. It does not think it is its own country, and it is distinct geopolitically from basically any other region on Earth. And we'll get into the reasons as to why that is true. But Taiwan's history is wrapped up entirely with China. China is obviously an incredibly important country. I believe it has been surpassed in population by India, but is the second largest country on Earth and probably the most important determinant of the next 50 to 100 years of geopolitics in the world. And Taiwan, especially, is the hot topic when it comes to everything about China. So I think this topic is incredibly timely and relevant, and we'll get into some of the history here. So Taiwan prior to the 20th century, so 1900 and before. So if you see anything about Taiwan in my context, it will usually be called the island of Formosa. So there were people that lived on Taiwan before there were Han Chinese people or Western settlements, but those Aboriginal peoples were displaced over time throughout the 15th, 16th centuries up until the modern day by Chinese and Western settlers. And but China, sorry, but Taiwan has the island of Formosa has always been within China's sphere of influence. Uh, Taiwan is an island just off the coast of China. So if we go back to this map, you can see it over on the right with the star label Taipei. That's the capital of Taiwan. And as you can see, it is very close to the mainland China. And so Taiwan has always had a quite close connection with China, and it's always been within um, imperial, like China's sphere of influence. So starting in 1895, Formosa or Taiwan was occupied by Japan. Japan at this point was an imperial power and expanding its influence over across East Asia and across the Pacific, and part of that would included capturing Taiwan. In the 1930s, because Japan was increasing its influence and also steadily upping its invasion of mainland China, it also engaged in an assimilation campaign in order to try to assimilate the island of Formosa into the Japanese Empire. That assimilation campaign was largely unsuccessful, but there still is a large amount of Japanese influence in Taiwanese culture today. And that is also important when realizing what we'll talk about later, the sort of Japanese-Taiwanese relationship. So Japan and Taiwan also have their own distinct history that goes back a long time. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Japan obviously lost, had to cede all of its territories, and so it ceded Taiwan back to mainland China, which was the governing body on mainland China was the Republic of China. So that is the ROC. So within the context of China Taiwan relations, you kind of have to go back to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s with the Chinese Civil War. So the Chinese Civil War was fought between 1927 and 1949 between the communists led by Mao Zedong against the nationalists or the Kuomintang or the KMT led by Chiang Kai-shek. There were hostilities starting out in 1927, but they sort of took a break because mainland China was being invaded by Japan. And so both the communists and the nationalists sort of had an uneasy truce in order to fight back against the Japanese. But once that war ended, hostilities really began to escalate in the early 40s and especially in the late 40s. And in one of the biggest underdog stories in maybe all of world history, the communists ended up coming out victorious. And in 1949, the KMT or the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan. So all their governing bodies, all of the elite that were in charge, they moved to Taiwan in order to flee from the communists. This wave of new settlers into Taiwan are called the 49ers. The 49ers at that point in 1950 made up about 15% of the population of Taiwan. So previous Taiwanese were about 85%, but the 49ers dominated Taiwanese politics and became the ruling bodies on the island. That is in part because in 1947, in response to some instability in Taiwan, the KMT dramatically cracked down and basically ended up eliminating or executing a large majority of Taiwanese elites in 1947. And so when they fled to the island in 1949, there was an already existent power vacuum of which they took up and sort of had a stranglehold over politics in Taiwan. So Taiwan after the Chinese Revolution from 1950s to 1980s was an incredibly authoritarian country. So the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had a complete stranglehold over politics of the country. I believe that there was the longest rule of martial law on the island. It lasted years and years and years, and it was incredibly centralized. But there was rapid economic development that occurred. Um, in the 70s, Chiang Kai-shek died, and Taiwan began this democratization process to where you see it today. So today it is highly democratic. It has a robust political system with checks and balances. It has a mixed parliamentary presidential system, but it's highly democratic and is also highly advanced. It has a large and robust manufacturing sector, and it is economically integrated with the world. China, so mainland China, after the revolution, from the early 1950s until Mao's death in 1976, had a largely command economy. So Mao Zedong had a quite centralized grip on politics and the economics of China, and so that lended itself to very centralized Marxist-Leninist Maoist sort of command economic principles. After Mao died and Deng Xiaoping took the rules and or took the reins in China, China entered its reform era until about that should say 1989. Well, actually, sorry, 1998 is about right. Somewhere along those lines, China opened up slightly politically, but a lot more so economically, and started integrating itself with the West and the rest of the world and liberalized its markets. And from 2013 to the present is the Xi Jinping era. So Xi Jinping um, became the head of the CCP in 2013. And the really important thing to know about the Xi Jinping era is that there has been a massive centralization of political power. So if one did not consider mainland China and the Republic of China to be authoritarian before, I think it's pretty hard to argue that it is not either authoritarian or autocratic today. Xi Jinping is undeniably the main political leader, has eliminated terms, and so for the foreseeable future will be the one sole leader of the CCP. And so that centralization and consolidation of political power is important when we talk about the importance of Taiwan to Xi Jinping. So back to 1950s, after um, the communists beat the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War and the nationalists flee to the island of Taiwan, you saw a very interesting dynamic that was largely influenced by the Cold War between China, the United States, and Taiwan. So at this point, China views Taiwan as a runaway province. So it believes that Taiwan is part of China and that mainland China, with the government in Beijing, is the proper ruler and government over Taiwan. But Taiwan also views itself as the rightful government of China. So you have two competing governments here, one in Beijing and the other in Taipei on the island of Taiwan, that both think that they are the rightful rulers of all of China. So Taiwan does not just view itself as the ruler of Taiwan. They think that they are the rightful government of all of China. And that continues to this day. So from 1950 to 1973-ish, there was very high tensions between both China and Taiwan, and also the USSR and the United States because of the Cold War. And China had close relations with the USSR, and the US had close relations with Taiwan. So, in fact, established in about the mid 1950s, the US created a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, so that obligated the United States to Taiwan's defense in the instance that Taiwan was attacked. In 1954, there was the first Taiwan Strait crisis, and then a few years later was the second Taiwan Strait crisis. The exact details aren't super important for our purposes, but things to know are that um, there were a lot of high tensions, and points at which there could have been military escalation. So at this point, the United States is pursuing a policy of containment. So China is explicitly communist. The United States is quite concerned about the spread of communism across the world, and China is one of the places where it's concerned about, especially. And you can see that with the Vietnam War, that the U.S. is especially concerned with the spread of communism in Asia. And so the U.S. sees its alliance established during the 50s with Taiwan as a way for it to help contain the spread of communism. And China sees this sort of capitalist force um, sort of right up against their back door and trying to contain their spread, their influence, and also denying them their rightful island that they believe is part of China itself. So from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the early part of the 70s, large high tensions between both China and the United States, as well as China and Taiwan. And Taiwan and the United States were probably at their closest diplomatic relations at any point. So starting in the 1970s, however, there was a thawing of this U.S.-China relationship. So this was shown and illustrated in Nixon's visit to China in 1973. This was a massive deal. It was an incredibly large deal that a president would visit a communist country that we had for so long villainized and within the Cold War mindset had sort of pushed off as like we were going to contain this country. So Nixon's visit was a very big deal, and it sort of illustrated a larger thawing of China-U.S. relations. And this is also further exemplified in Reagan's 1982 document called the Third Communique, in which he was attempting to reduce tensions with China. China had expressed its displeasure with the fact that the US was continuing to diplomatically and militarily support Taiwan, because remember, China views Taiwan as a runaway province and essentially a rogue government. And so they are not especially pleased with the fact that the US has continued to support Taiwan. So, in an effort to sort of appease or help reduce the tensions with China, Reagan issues this third communique in which the U.S. quote intends to reduce gradually its sales of arms to Taiwan. There's no time frame given for this, and the U.S. This isn't binding in any way. It's not a treaty. There's no legal obligation, but it is something diplomatically that the U.S. has said that it will do, but really has not done. Our sales of arms to Taiwan has continued, and China is not particularly pleased about that, which we'll talk more about later. So there were multiple causes for why China and the US thawed their relationship. Not super important, but for our purposes. But one was the Sino-Soviet split. So throughout the 1960s, China distanced itself pretty heavily from the Soviet Union. And because the main opponent of the US in the Cold War was the Soviet Union, the United States and Nixon and Henry Kissinger became much more willing to work with China. And drive a wedge between China and the USSR. And the second reason was the reform era that we talked about with regard to China, which was that after Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping implemented a bunch of economic reforms, you now had a very large, rapidly developing economy that had a much more liberalized market. And so there were a lot more opportunities for the US and China to economically cooperate with one another. And so that was another reason why the tensions thawed between the two countries. So that sort of leads us to 1979, which is really the pinnacle and the most important year that defines the modern relationship between the US, China, and Taiwan. So in 1979, a bunch of things happen. So first is that the US gives full diplomatic recognition of China to mainland China and the government in Beijing. So it fully recognizes the People's Republic of China. Because remember, at this point, you had the Republic of China, run by the KMT, who had fled to the islands of Taiwan, and they had the government set up in Taipei. And then you had the People's Republic of China, the PRC, headed by the CCP and the communists, that had the government established in mainland China in Beijing. And both of these governments felt that they were the true sole leader and like legitimate government of all of China, including Taiwan. And so up until that point, the US had recognized Taiwan, or the government in Taipei, and the ROC as the true, diplomatic, true legitimate government of all of China. And in 1979, it flipped that diplomatic recognition to the government in Beijing. And so it severed their de jure relations with Taiwan. So their actual like legitimate relations with Taiwan is switched. The U.S. supported the United Nations accepting the government from Beijing as opposed to the government from Taipei. The U.S. also recognizes a one China policy. So a one China policy is basically a continuation of the status quo that we talking about before, where both the government in Beijing and the government in Taipei do not think that they are two separate entities. Neither of them think that Taiwan is its own separate independent country. Rather, they think that there is one China. Like on paper, there is just one China. Even in reality, that there's effectively a split between the two. So it's like both sides recognize that there are competing governments at play, but both sides also recognize that there should only be one China, and that there should not be a split between the two, and that Taiwan is not its own independent country. So the U.S. commits to sort of recognizing and continuing to uphold this one China policy. Um, so the U.S. is turning more towards China. They're thawing relations with China. They've diplomatically recognized them. They've committed to reducing arms sales to Taiwan. They've recognized the one China policy, which is very important to the government in Beijing and to the CCP. But it is not really super willing to fully give up its relations with Taiwan for a bunch of reasons that we'll talk about later. But one is that really that Taiwan is an important partner, both economically and diplomatically, to the United States. And so the United States still feels as though it wants to have a working relationship with Taiwan. And so Congress passes in 1979 the Taiwan Relations Act, which obligates the U.S. to basically have de facto relations with Taiwan, even though de jure relations with Taiwan are cut off. So remember, the U.S. no longer diplomatically recognizes the government in Taipei or Taiwan as the legitimate governor of all of China, but it does establish that it will have cultural and military relations with the government in Taiwan. And the passage here that I've included in quotes is an incredibly important one. So the US will quote, consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, including by boycotts or embargoes, a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific area and of grave concern to the United States. So the Taiwan Relationship Act replaces the Mutual Defense Treaty that was created between the US and Taiwan in the mid 50s. So the US no longer is legally obligated by treaty to come to Taiwan's defense. However, this language that is included in the Taiwan Relations Act, or also called the TRA, is important because it says that essentially if China attempts to militarily or otherwise coercively attempt to take over Taiwan, that would be threatening and of grave concern to the United States. So here the U.S. is saying, look, China, we diplomatically recognize you, and like we agree, we're not going to diplomatically recognize Taiwan. We're going to pull back our arms sales, but you really shouldn't invade Taiwan. Like that's not happening. We will come to their defense. Essentially, we don't actively obligate ourselves. The United States does not obligate themselves to intervene militarily, but they send a signal that is telling China to not do anything coercive or militarily invade Taiwan to take it back over. So that sort of brings up the modern context of the US China Taiwan relations and the incentives and motivations for each side. So on China's side, they seek reunification with Taiwan. So they still view the government in Taipei and Taiwan as a runaway province and a runaway government. And they think that they are the legitimate government over all of China, including Taiwan. And so Xi Jinping and the rest of the CCP has, since the Chinese Revolution has said that reunification is an objective of the CCP, and that has continued to this day. So the U.S., specifically military leaders, have feared that China will seek to invade Taiwan. So whether they will or they won't is beyond the scope of this lecture. There are a bunch of very smart people who say that China is looking to invade within the next 5 to 10 years. They're rapidly building up their military. They're conducting military exercises around Taiwan. There are a bunch of other folks who say that they're much more likely to work on peacefully integrating and reunifying with Taiwan via economic or diplomatic means. And so there's arguments to be made on both sides of that. But there certainly is a realistic fear on the United States side, especially in the military community, looking at Chinese military exercises and Chinese military buildup, that there is a risk that China will invade and take over Taiwan if they feel that they have an opportunity to do so. So China seeks reunification. They've said that they would like to do so peacefully. Um, but Xi Jinping has not been afraid to signal that he is perhaps willing to go beyond peace reunification if that is looking unlikely. So, and we'll talk about why that is important for Xi Jinping specifically a little bit later. On Taiwan's end, they seek to maintain the status quo largely. So Taiwan today, as mentioned earlier, it is a highly advanced highly advanced manufacturing and democratic society. So the people there are like largely happy with the status quo. They get the benefits of being de facto independent of China. So the Chinese government in Beijing really has no control or influence or power over the people of Taiwan. There's they're de facto two different like governmental systems. So they get the benefits of being independent without actually having to call themselves independent. And in that way, the vast majority of people in Taiwan prefer the status quo, where they aren't technically independent, but they basically are in reality. So Taiwan wants to not go to war because that would be very bad for them. They would prefer also not to be taken over by China. But most people do not support independence outright. The US, for its position, continues to abide by the one China policy that we talked about earlier, and also continues to commit to a policy of strategic ambiguity. So, a policy of strategic ambiguity basically says that we will neither confirm nor deny whether we would defend Taiwan in the event of a military invasion. And this is attempting to balance two goals of the United States. So, the first is deterrence. As we'll talk about a bit more later, the United States has a pretty large interest in making sure that China does not capture or take over Taiwan. And so the US is seeking to deter any thoughts of in the CCP or Beijing of taking over Taiwan. But they also are wary of being entrapped and ensnared in a conflict. And the US does not want to go to war with China. China has an incredibly large military, and it would be both militarily and economically just ruinous for both countries if there were to be a full scale war, and war is bad, and US leaders recognize that. And so they're also concerned about coming out and absolutely saying that we will defend Taiwan in all instances, because in that case, there might be instances where the US is entrapped or ensnared into a conflict that it does not want to be in. So US continues to abide by one China and strategic ambiguity. But the US sees China as an unambiguous geopolitical competitor. So 10 years ago or so, this may have not been the case. So during the 1990s, certainly the 2000s a little bit, and the start of the 2010s, the United States had varying levels of optimism, but there was optimism nonetheless about the ability to integrate China into its rules-based international system. That optimism has entirely dissipated in the past 8 to 10 years. So basically, every politician on both sides of the aisle agree that China is a geopolitical competitor and a threat to the rules-based international system. And that does not mean that war is inevitable, but it does mean that the U.S. has oriented its foreign policy around competing with China, essentially geopolitically, which will come into play on the next slide. So why does all this matter? So Taiwan's a tiny little island. There's like 23 million people there. Okay, it's a democracy, but like who cares? Who cares about this tiny little island? The answer is everybody, and for a couple of reasons. So first is that China and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping especially, absolutely care about Taiwan. It is probably the single most important issue uh, in Chinese politics is Taiwan. And there's a long history associated with why this is the case, but part of it is because the idea of sovereignty and for China having the full control over its territories is incredibly important to it. So there was this thing called the Century of Humiliation, in which foreign European powers, as well as America and Japan, continually infringed upon the sovereignty of China and throughout the in order for economic reasons essentially. And that cultural and generational memory has created an incredible importance about sovereignty. And reclaiming its past territories and having control over those territories within the Chinese cultural memory. And so in the public at large, but especially in the political scheme. And so for the CCP and Xi Jinping, this is a matter of political legitimacy. So in democracies, largely political legitimacy is derived from the system of democracy itself. So the reason why, the United States has political legitimacy and, debatably is in large part because there are elections in which the populace is able to engage with, and therefore people abide by the outcomes of those results, and the people who are elected have the legitimate have political legitimacy because they were elected through a democratic process. China really doesn't have that. It's a pretty autocratic centralized state. The CCP is the one singular political party, and so they cannot really derive their political legitimacy from the essence of the political system themselves in the way that democracies can. And so they have to couple this and backstop this with other forms of legitimacy in order to prevent the downfall of their political system. And the way that they have historically done this is through economic growth. And so China, for decades and decades and decades, starting in the 1970s, has had a very, very large growth rate and has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And in that way, it has derived political legitimacy from the fact that it was increasing the well being of its citizens. And that's a pretty effective way of maintaining power and political authority. That no longer is necessarily the case. So Chinese economic growth has slowed down pretty substantially. There are large demographic problems that China is facing. Um, and the scope of like Chinese political issues or whether the Chinese political system is unsustainable or whatever, well beyond the scope of this lecture. But there are concerns within the Chinese establishment that with the lack of economic growth and with demographic issues that will continue into the future, that there will need to be some other form of political legitimacy. And that has usually come in the form of nationalism. So nationalism, the idea that there is an essence to a group of individuals who share a collective identity of what their national group is, what their ethnic group is, what have you. And part of that for China is this idea of sovereignty and to reclaim past territories. And so because um, sovereignty in Taiwan in particular is such an important issue for the Chinese populace, it is incredibly important for Xi Jinping and the CCP overall to show that it is committed to maintaining and reclaiming China's sovereignty, essentially. And so that's why Taiwan is such an important issue for for Xi Jinping's political legitimacy. For the United States, there are a few other reasons why Taiwan's important. So, as sort of alluded to earlier, um, the United States sees China as a threat to its rule-based international order. The rule-based international order is a set of norms and institutions, including freedom of navigation in the seas, the United Nations, alliance structures, things like that, that allow the United States to essentially maintain power. And the United States feels as though it is in their national security interest to maintain this rules-based international order. And the idea of a democracy that is self-governed and running pretty effectively being taken over by an autocratic state is a threat to that system because it goes against a lot of the norms of the rules-based LAO, one of which is the importance of democracy. And second is that especially after we had a large state infringe upon the sovereignty of another state, i.e., Russia invading Ukraine, China doing so, Taiwan would again represent a threat to that sort of system that places a large amount of importance on sovereignty as well. So there are differing conceptions between the United States' idea of sovereignty and China's idea of sovereignty. Then you can see how those sort of conflict in the context of Taiwan. Give me one second. And the last reason why Taiwan is important is because of geopolitical competition. So once again, the US sees China unambiguously as a geopolitical competitor. China less so. They have different conceptions of what competition is or whether there even is a competition, but the US certainly sees it that way. And there are certainly arguments to be made that China is attempting to displace the United States as the global hegemon, or at least the regional hegemon within East Asia. And so one reason why Taiwan is incredibly important is because of its geographic location, and specifically the concept of island chains, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And the second is because of semiconductors. So this was a lot less relevant 10 or 20 years ago, and maybe even 10 years ago, but now it is especially important. Semiconductors are also called chips. They are basically what allows computing power to get to the point at which to run all advanced like machines. So like all future emerging technology, including like military systems, artificial intelligence, etc., will rely upon highly advanced semiconductors. And there are only a few companies in the world that are making these highly advanced semiconductors. So the three most important ones really are TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, Samsung, which is based in South Korea, and then there are a few others, including like NVIDIA, Intel, in the United States, and China also has their own. But really, TSMC is the top dog when it comes to semiconductors. And so Taiwan has the most important manufacturer of advanced semiconductors and basically a chokehold over the market. Like the drop off between TSMC and the other companies is pretty astronomical. And so currently, because the United States still has a good working relationship with Taiwan, Taiwan is, the TSMC is continuing to sell advanced semiconductors to the United States and its allies, which is allowing them to integrate it into their military technology and also other advanced technologies. But China taking over Taiwan would certainly lead to either the elimination of those factories, or it would lead to China taking over control of that technology and be able to manufacture them themselves, which is in a lot of people's minds a grave threat to the US's national security, because China would then be able to have a chokehold over those semiconductors, and it could use them to advance their own military technology or things like artificial intelligence, quantum technology, etc., and restrict the US's ability to do so the same. So going back to this idea of Taiwan's geostrategic importance. So here's a map of China, and there's this concept of island chains. This concept was, I believe, initially developed by Germany, and then it was appropriated by Japan, and then it was taken by the United States, and now it's being reappropriated by China. But all the relevant actors sort of believe in this concept within their military establishments to varying degrees. And the idea is that there are sets of islands that run north to south in the Asia Pacific that basically act as barriers to China's ability to project power outward into the rest of the Pacific. So the Pacific is super big and it's full of water. And water is really, really difficult for militaries to get across. So it takes multiple weeks for the United States to send boats from it to the other side of the Pacific. And large areas of space are really difficult to like put military power on, project power across, because obviously you need boats to be able to do so. Boats can be sunk with missiles, planes can bomb boats, etc. And so islands are incredibly important for being able to both determine military power projection, but also to conduct trade. And so there are these concepts called island chains that basically act as barriers to China's ability to project power into the broader Pacific. So you can see that there's this first island chain that starts in Japan, which is a US ally, runs down into Okinawa, which is part of Japan, and where the US has a military base and thousands of troops stationed, and then is connected to Taiwan. So Taiwan is really the base of the first island chain. The first island chain then continues down into the Philippines, which is another US ally, continues down to Malaysia, which is a US military partner. So the US dominates the first island chain, and there are lots of fears from the US military establishment and parts of the US academic community that are concerned that if China is able to take over Taiwan, they would be able to break the first island chain and essentially project power into the Philippine Sea and beyond into the Pacific. And from China's perspective, taking Taiwan would be a great way in order to break out of this containment that the United States has put itself in. So if you go back to this Cold War mentality of the United States needs to contain the rise of communism or the spread of communism, these island chains are one part and parcel of it. So from China's perspective, especially because they are surrounded by U.S. allies, so South Korea, U.S. ally, Japan, U.S. ally, Taiwan, essentially U.S. ally, Philippines, U.S. ally, Malaysia is a U.S. military partner, Vietnam, military partner, Thailand, U.S. ally. And so China sees itself surrounded and contained by the United States. And so being able to capture, course, or invade Taiwan and take over Taiwan would give it a base of operations from which to break the island chain and extend and continue the pressure the second island chain. So from a geopolitical perspective, Taiwan is incredibly important, and it is the U.S.'s basically like first line of defense to preventing Chinese expansion elsewhere. So in the modern day, how does the U.S. support Taiwan? And the answer is mostly militarily. So how does the U.S. go about giving military support to Taiwan? The answer is primarily arms sales. So the U.S. sells a bunch of weapons to Taiwan. We sell a whole bunch of different weapons. I believe Taiwan is our fourth biggest recipient slash customer of arms sales originating from the United States, and we easily sell the most weapons to Taiwan out of any country. So the most important weapon that we sell Taiwan are F-16s. F-16s are fighter jets, and we've sold them to Taiwan since I believe the 90s. And we've continued to sell them and continue to sell them spare and repair parts up until this day. In 2019, we agreed to sell them 66 more F-16s. I believe we have not delivered them. I think the delivery date is hovering around 2026, but there have been some delays to that. So we'll see if that actually holds true. But we've also sold them surface ships like destroyers. We've sold them Abrams tanks. I believe we had another sale of about 100 Abrams tanks that we've yet to deliver them, but Abrams tanks are more modern tanks. They're pretty important. The U.S. military uses them a lot. Radar systems, SAMs, which are surface-to-air missiles, Javelins, which are anti-tank missiles. So we sold a lot of those to Ukraine, which was really important for Ukraine being able to defend against Russia. So we're also selling them to Taiwan. And then spare parts and repair, we're continuously selling them. So Taiwan buys as many arms as it can. So Taiwan is paranoid about China invading it, which, for good reason, right? It's like if you are the governing authority in Taipei, and you had one of the biggest militaries next door, and they're intent on reunifying, and they're concerned that they're not going to be able to do so peacefully. I would also be concerned about the threat of invasion, especially with China's recent military activities around the region. And so Taiwan gets its hands on as many weapons as it can, and its primary way of doing so is via the United States. We also provide other military aid. So the most relevant form of military aid for our discussion comes in the Taiwan Policy Act, which was passed in 2022 by Congress. So the Taiwan Policy Act opens up billions of dollars in possible military aid that is available to Taiwan in the form of defense loans or defense grants. So Taiwan can basically take money to spend on this military. And then the Taiwan Policy Act also opens up the possibility for direct transfer of weapons from U.S. defense stocks. So these are not arms sales, but we are effectively just giving weapons that are in the U.S. stocks over to Taiwan. The only other country that we currently have the system set up for is Ukraine. So Ukraine, we take weapons from our defense stocks that the U.S. military owns. It's like the U.S. military's, and then we shoot them off to Ukraine. So we have the same system in place for Taiwan, should that be a possibility. That's different from arms sales, which are created and manufactured by U.S. companies and then sold to Taiwan. But those arms sales never run through the U.S. military themselves. It is direct from U.S. companies selling, U.S. private companies selling to Taiwan, as opposed to direct transfer, which is U.S. military weapons going directly to Taiwan. So that's the overall military support that exists currently that the proposition could attempt to reduce. So now we're going to get into very quickly run through the possible and most likely arguments that both sides can make. So on the pro, I think there are three general categories of arguments that one can make in support of the idea that the US should reduce its military support to Taiwan. So the first is de-escalation. So Taiwan is one of the biggest hotspots in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, going to war with China would devastate the globe. So first is that both countries make up a substantial portion of the US or of the global economy. And so going to war would be devastating for the global economy. It would have implications for basically every aspect of international cooperation, international development. Like modern life would be turned on its head in the event that the US and China went to full scale war with one another. So, from an economic perspective, from a military perspective, because tons of people would die, it would be very bad. Not to mention the fact that both sides have nuclear weapons, and so there is a risk in escalation to the nuclear level, which would obviously be bad. So there are some who argue that the United States needs to reduce its arms sales specifically um, to Taiwan in order to de-escalate the tensions in the region and make it less likely that the United States is entrapped in a war with China. And this does have some, historical support for it. So in 1995 to 1996, there was the third Taiwan Strait crisis. Once again, the exact details are not super important, but just know that there were some military tensions in the area that flared up at this time. And one of the causes, according to some, were that was that China was pretty upset about the sale of F-16s because F-16s are a pretty potent fighter jet. They're certainly not the most advanced fighter jet in the world, especially today. Things like F-22s or F-35s are more advanced, but F-16s can definitely pack a punch and can contest airspace pretty effectively and are pretty good at fighting Chinese fighters. And so F-16s, out of all the things that we sent to Taiwan, are the most um, I guess expensive, but also demonstrate the most capability. And so they are the thing that China is the most concerned and has the most expresses the most displeasure about. But they're also obviously annoyed about the rest of it and the fact that the U.S. can to support Taiwan at all, obviously because they view Taiwan as a runaway province. So I would imagine that the core of the core of the pro argument will be that there's a high risk of Taiwan war that is caused by the U.S. sending a bunch of military support and aid and arms to Taiwan. Reducing that would be good and would be beneficial and avoid the risk of conflict. The second sort of bucket of pro argument are China relations. So, as I mentioned at the top of this lecture, China represents probably the most important country that will define geopolitics for the next 50 at least years, perhaps up to 100 or even beyond that. It's rapidly growing, it's super large. It is an incredibly important country. And what that means is that a lot of international issues will be dependent upon the United States' relationship with China. The US China relationship is easily the most important relationship in international politics in the entire world. And right now, that relationship is incredibly stained primarily because of Taiwan. And there is a mismatch in terms of how much China cares about Taiwan. So, reminder that Taiwan is China's number one core issue. Whereas for the United States, that is not the case. Like if you ask most people in the United States what is their most important international concern or whatever, it's not going to be Taiwan. There's a asymmetry in terms of interests, and this results in a lot of tensions in the U.S.-China relationship that spills out beyond just military or diplomatic. It impacts climate, human rights, our approach to North Korea and attempting to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula or otherwise attempting to rein in Kim Jong Un's pretty aggressive, hostile approaches in some areas, regulating emerging technology like quantum, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, things like that. And so there are a set of people who believe that should the United States back away from Taiwan, in part by reducing military support, that it would allow the United States to recatalyze its relationship with China and form a much deeper bonds with the country. and essentially allow it to rekindle cooperation in all these other areas, which would be incredibly beneficial and important. Um, the last bucket, I think, is a recalculation of military support. So this is sort of the opposite of the former two, but I think this style of pro argument would basically say that we should reduce some type of military support because that military support is not actually helping Taiwan defend itself. And instead, we should shift to some other type of military support. So I think this is most prominent when it comes to what folks are calling a porcupine strategy. So there are some, for instance, who say that really flashy and large um, sales of arms to Taiwan that are super expensive, like the F-16s, perhaps like Abrams tanks, are not exceptionally good at helping Taiwan to defend against invasion. So instead, we should reduce our military support of those high ticket items, but instead shift to more regular, lower level weapons that are going to be better at defending against invasion. So, for instance, you could buy a ton of sea mines or missiles for the cost of a single F-16. And in terms of bang for your buck, you're probably better off with a bunch more um, missiles or surface ships or sea mines to defend yourself against amphibious invasion than a couple of fighter jets. And so there are a contingent of folks who believe that the US's current military support strategy is not helpful to Taiwan, and we should instead reverse it. So now moving on to con arguments. So I think there are two main ones, and then I'll talk about like some other flavors of arguments. But I think the two main ones are one, assurances. So Taiwan is not a de jure U.S. ally. We do not have an actual treaty obligation to defend them, but for all intents and purposes, they are a U.S. ally. We have said that they are incredibly important. They are an incredibly important partner in the Indo-Pacific for our Indo-Pacific strategy. We've said that they're important for the rules-based international order, and we have continued to send aid support both diplomatically and militarily to Taiwan across decades because we believe it is in our interest and the interests of our allies. And reminder that East Asia and Southeast Asia has a ton of US allies. South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, um, Thailand, and Australia are all allies who depend greatly on the United States' continued military support. And so the argument here would be that if the United States sort of does a 180 and reduces its military support to Taiwan, that it would end up hurting our relationships with our other allies because our other allies would fear that the US is no longer committed to their defense in East Asia and hence would take actions that are lead to negative outcomes. So a few common arguments here are one that South Korea and Japan, if they fear that the United States will either withdraw from their alliance or reduce military support to them because they reduce military support to Taiwan, would proliferate and develop their own nuclear weapons. Both South Korea and Japan are highly advanced countries, and they have a bunch of nuclear scientists because they have a decent amount of nuclear power. And most analysts say that they would be able to develop nuclear weapons if they chose to do so within at least a few years, maybe like 5 to 10, but they could probably do so. And so there is a large fear that should the US flip flop on some of its commitments, that South Korea and Japan would make the decision to develop nuclear weapons, which would probably be harmful for regional stability. And there are other ways to impact this out. So South Korea, Japan, and Australia in particular, those three allies are really, really important for a lot of what the United States wants to do. So things like export restrictions to prevent China from getting its hands on advanced technologies, things like developing advanced technologies of its own, things like maintaining supply chains for critical minerals in order to continue to develop its economy and develop its own military technology and work to uphold a rules-based international order. All those things are reliant upon a strong relationship with those three allies. And so harming those relationships could severely impact a large part of what is helpful for defending U.S. national security interests. So first bucket, assurances, plan freaks out allies. allies react in bad ways and hurts our relationship. That's bad. Second main argument is deterrence. So this argument is pretty simple. It is that China um, wants to take over Taiwan, wants to reunify with Taiwan. They know that they are not going to be able to peacefully reunify with Taiwan because the Taiwanese populace does not think that the Taiwanese people do not want to reunify. And so China knows that its only option is to do so coercively via invasion or blockade of Taiwan. But the reason it is not doing so is because the United States has continued to send military support to Taiwan. And so Taiwan is able to defend itself. And China also knows that the US is likely to get involved if it were to invade. So the argument goes that if we reduce military support to Taiwan, then Taiwan would be less able to defend itself against a Chinese invasion, or it would signal to China that the United States would be less likely to get militarily involved in a conflict over Taiwan. And so China's calculus would then flip, and they would choose to invade Taiwan. And that would be bad for a whole bunch of reasons. One is like a war would occur. That would be really bad. Tens of millions of people would die. But second, for all the sort of geopolitical and democracy and rules-based international order reasons that we talked about previously, China taking Taiwan or even attempting to blockade or take Taiwan would be very, very bad for the global order, global system. And the global economy would immediately enter recession if that were to occur because of the importance of the Taiwanese manufacturing industry and specifically with semiconductors. So I'll finish this off with some other possible arguments that the con side can make. So the first is appeasement. Appeasement is maybe essentially a mix of assurance or deterrence. It's basically deterrence, but slightly lessened. So as opposed to the argument that if we reduce military support to Taiwan, then China will invade, this argument is more nuanced, and that is if the United States reduces military support to Taiwan, it indicates to China that the United States is less willing to challenge China on a lot of foreign policy issues or on military issues. And so it is more likely to be aggressive in other areas, even if they don't invade Taiwan. So, for instance, if the US shows a sign of weakness by reducing military support, China may see this as the United States not being willing to uphold its interests in the Asia Pacific. And so it would be more willing to aggress in the South China Sea, make more expansionist claims in the South China Sea, fight Japan over the Senkaku Islands, engage South Korea in the Yellow Sea, things like that. So second is a quid pro quo style argument. So this was pretty relevant in the mid 2010s. I am unsure how relevant it is now, given that tensions are a lot higher between the US and China now than they were a decade ago. I don't think this argument is great, but there were a couple of folks back in the mid 2010s, specifically Charles Glazer, Michael Swain, who made arguments that the United States should essentially offer to reduce its support of Taiwan in exchange for China doing something else. So most of the time, this was withdrawing its claims from the South China Sea or being less aggressive in other areas. And so the argument goes that if the United States reduces its support to Taiwan unilaterally, then it no longer has the leverage to sort of force China into these other agreements that would be good. And that Chinese expansion into the South China Sea or the Yellow Sea or over the Senkaku Islands or the East China Sea or what have you is bad. Last is politics. So as I mentioned previously, basically every politician and their mother thinks that U.S. defending Taiwan, or rather U.S. supporting Taiwan and opposing China is a good thing. And so it would be a political nightmare if a president were to unilaterally reduce military support to Taiwan. The other party would immediately point the finger and start blaming them, but also there would be immense backlash within their own political party, almost certainly. And so I think elections would actually be the elections disadvantage would actually be a great argument on this topic. Obviously, that's not going to work because the election's in just a few days, but I do think politics arguments will make a comeback. So I think that's all that I have. So happy to answer any questions if you all have them, but that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Adam. If anybody does have any questions, seriously, feel free to unmute yourself, ask Adam directly, or if you'd like, you can certainly post in the chat. Um, I guess there's a question that I would like to ask Adam. I know that you sort of touched on it earlier, but what is the likelihood of Taiwanese politicians and populists uh, possibly, using the affirmative as an impetus to either declare independence or do something in that direction? I'm curious if you have thoughts there at all.
Yeah. So my gut instinct would be with regard to declaring independence, pretty much zero. So even the most gung ho Taiwanese politicians are very, very concerned about angering China too much because the last thing they want is for China to attempt invasion. Like that is the absolute last thing that anyone in Taiwan wants. And so, like the the reason why the government in Taipei cares a whole lot about military support is because it wants to avoid China invasion, and it thinks that military support would help it out. So I don't think that in the event that the United States reduced military support to Taiwan, that it would cause them to declare independence because that just makes it all the more likely that China would take the opportunity to invade. Now, would it take other steps? Perhaps. I think that probably depends on the degree to which the US reduces its military support. So if the US were to, for say, cut off all military support and effectively declare that Taiwan was on its own, I think that there's a decent likelihood that Taiwan would perhaps develop nuclear weapons of its own because there are some who say that it has capabilities to do so. And it certainly probably would look for other ways to obtain military support from other countries. So I think the Netherlands has sold them arms before. They would definitely try to increase their own defense industrial base to be able to defend themselves. I can't really see them declaring independence, but
Yeah, that's actually what I
they
was going
would
to
probably take
ask,
other actions.
is about the domestic sort of, as you mentioned it, the defense industrial base in Taiwan, which seems to be relatively robust considering it's, not necessarily autonomous. Looks as if they have increased some of their potential. You think that it could possibly lead to nuclearization? I know obviously it depends on whether or not the United States reduced probably their military support to the, likelihood that it's almost an elimination, which I know is not necessarily what we're talking about here. But any thoughts about, or can you tell us anything about Taiwan's industrial base and what they do domestically?
Yeah, so I'm not the most familiar with what they can do specifically, and like there's a reason why they have to rely on the United States defense industrial base for a lot of their weapons. I've certainly seen folks who in the scholarly community who think that Taiwan has the capabilities to develop nuclear weapons or highly advanced weapons. They certainly have less capability than like Japan or South Korea and the nuclearization context, and so I think that one is a bit more of a stretch in terms of highly advanced weapons systems themselves. Those things, well, Taiwan probably has the technical know-how if it really put a lot of time, money, and resources into developing those things. It seems likely given their past and their manufacturing pedigree in other areas that they would be able to develop capabilities, but that takes a lot of time. And defense industrial bases don't arise out of nowhere. And for the longest time, Taiwan has had pretty robust assurances from the United States that they will get a continuous stream of arms sales. And so it has less impetus for developing it on their own. So I think, yes, they would be able to in the long term, but in the short term, it seems pretty unlikely that they would be able to rapidly scale up to any significant degree to which it would help them defend against a Chinese invasion.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and feel free to ask Adam directly. If not, again, feel free to send something in the text. Adam, this is going to be an inside joke mostly between you and I, but I do recall. Do you already know what I'm going to ask?
I don't. There's a lot of inside jokes. We'll see which one this is.
You may recall that there was a particular acronym, and if I remember correctly, you're the one who
Oh
created
yes,
this. TechRow.
TechRow.
TechRow, yeah. You're gonna have to forgive me. It was the Taiwanese Economic and something else Council or Relations
It was the
Office.
Taiwanese Economic and Cultural Representative Office.
That's what it was. Yeah, yeah. No, that was a good time.
Yeah,
Uh,
which is funnily enough a 20-minute walk from Georgetown.
you're kidding.
Um,
No way.
so it is a cute little office building.
It's
But
like a
yeah,
de
for
facto embassy, right?
so it is a de facto embassy. It is not technically an embassy, but the
Okay.
we do not sell weapons to Taiwan. We sell them to the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office.
Which, for those of you who are watching and you have no idea what I'm talking about, and you have no idea what Adam's messaging, it may behoove you to find answers to this argument and do some independent research yourself. We we popped a number of team, including novices, that took out teams with Tournament of Champions bids on this argument back in 2019. It was about as funny as it was endearing. Not a legitimately good argument, but one that does deserve a response, and those who can't answer it deserve to lose, I feel. Regardless, it does look like our time is up. I am so appreciative to you, Adam White, for you to be able to, kind of lend your expertise to us, and also it does not go without saying that you modified a lot of this in the jargon and old school public forum concepts, calling it the con. That's a good old school
I
concept there. I
Yeah,
love
I
that.
started typing out app and egg and had to catch myself. So
No, it's okay. I think most, especially national circuit oriented teams, still use the designation of AF and neg. But regardless, I think that this is a real treat, not only for me, but certainly for students that are either viewing now or viewing later. I'm going to go ahead and upload this to YouTube. But Adam, I'm so grateful for you lending an ear, or lending us your expertise. I think it's incredible for you to do. Hope all is well at Georgetown. And if we've got additional questions and things like that, I may bother you. And who knows, might create another YouTube video that spurs off of this one. So thank you again, Adam. We appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Well,